Hey, it's Zach. Remember to tune in to The Last Dance, which continues this Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern on ESPN. Listen to the wrap-up podcast hosted by Jalen and Jacoby immediately following the broadcast, which is brought to you by State Farm. When you want the real deal like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Coverage is also brought to you by AT&T. You can find Jalen and Jacoby wherever you get your podcasts. Now more than ever, we have to look out for each other and count on each other. Marathon wants you to know that you can count on them for high-quality, top-tier gas. Marathon gasolines are formulated with STP additives. They keep your vehicle running at peak performance by optimizing fuel economy, removing those ugly deposit buildups, and by reducing emissions. That's good. And right now, you can get 5 cents off every gallon every day with Make It Count rewards from Marathon. Plus, you can earn points for additional savings on fuel, airfare, hotels, and more. This is definitely a deal you can count on. It's quick and easy to join. Just download the free Make It Count app or go to makeitcount.com/radio and start saving today. This offer is valid only at participating Marathon stations. Remember, wherever you need to go, be safe. The people at Marathon are behind you all the way.
And now, the Lowe Post.
Welcome to the Lowe Post podcast, where it's still 1998 and not 2020 because 2020 sucks. And I am thrilled to be joined by someone who was around the Chicago Bulls a lot, including during the first three-peat, and someone who occasionally lets me go on his television show in the morning, the one and only Mike Greenberg. How are you?
I'm terrific, Zach. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm a fan of this, and so I'm thrilled to be here.
Like I said, I've been living, I wrote a big Tony Kukoc story last week, a big Pacers Bulls story. Like I have chosen to exit 2020 because it's too depressing and go back and relive my like late teens and early 20s. It's a great time. It's like, hey, Rick Smits, how are you doing? Rick Smits, you're still really sad about 1998, but it's fun to talk to you. It's been a good time.
I've enjoyed it too. And I've been working. So I think I sometimes jokingly say of all the people that I know, from a professional standpoint, my schedule and life have been probably impacted less than anyone I know during this. But I've loved seeing Last Dance, and I think for different reasons, because it's not often that we get to relive our youth. Like the biggest difference between those days and now, for me, I was there and now I'm here, is that when stuff was going on, I was 24, 25, 26 years old. And it's reminding me of the way I viewed things then. You know, in some ways, it's not that the world was simpler or better or worse, but I was younger, and everything seems simpler and better when you're younger. So it has been like a trip back to my youth with home movies that don't contain me. You know, they're someone else's home movies, but I was close enough to them that they matter to me in a personal way. So I've really gotten a thrill. And I'll tell you very quickly one other thing. My son is 17 and he loves basketball. And I think you and I have discussed the fact that he really has never in his lifetime existed in a world where the Knicks were a really relevant team. They had that one good year. They made a little bit of a playoff push, but for the most part, he has never seen the Knicks matter. So that kind of breaks my heart a little bit as a kid who grew up going to the Garden all of my childhood. And he also is one of these people who will tell me that LeBron James is definitely a better player than Michael Jordan. So I have gotten extraordinary pleasure out of watching these films with him and showing him all the ways in which that isn't true.
Well, so much of how we process sports is, and how we process anything, is we tend to like what we saw first. And so it's as stupid as like every night at 10 o'clock, except when the Last Dance is on, my wife and I are binging this silly show called The Great British Bake Off, which is a baking competition. It's like our wind down show. And I like the first version that I saw better than the most recent version that I've seen just because I saw it first. It's like a lot of people who love mid-range jumpers and don't like threes, it's just because they grew up watching mid-range jumpers and not threes. And if you flip the order, they might feel totally differently. So for me, Michael's championship runs span age 13 to age 20 for me. So that's your coming of age as a sports fan. That's going from like kid who's like dimly aware of sophisticated sports analysis into like young adulthood. So there will never be anybody in sports who is Michael Jordan for me as just as a consumer of sports. It doesn't matter if LeBron breaks the scoring record. It doesn't matter if he wins 3 more championships. Like, he will never resonate with me and people my age the way Michael Jordan did. It's just not possible.
And that is the moment that it occurred to me at some point during this that eventually we all become our dad. Because my dad would be the one who was telling me, Michael, and I do a terrible imitation of my dad, he would be saying to me, Michael, if you don't put Oscar Robertson in this conversation, then we're no longer having it. Like, you don't have any idea what you're talking about. If you're telling me you don't think Oscar Robertson was every bit as good as any of these guys you're talking about, your Julius Erving you're so excited about, and anyone else I may have liked in the late 70s, which is when I'm a little older than you are. So I came of age as a basketball fan. I just missed the championship Knicks. I'm just like, I slept in Walt Frazier's pajamas. Not literally his, but I slept in New York Knicks number 10 footy pajamas. And so but I just missed them. So my Knicks teams of note, the earliest ones I remember were like Toby Knight and Glenn Gondrzik and Larry Demick and all sorts of people like that. But then it came to Bernard King. Yeah. So when the Knicks got Bernard King and Hubie had those teams where they played the full first unit and the full second unit, that will always be my favorite team of all time. When they took the Celtics, the legendary Celtics 7 games, when Bernard King scored 50 points in all those games, that was when I fell in love with basketball. And so to me, I'll never love anything like I loved that. But I'll never see another player like Michael Jordan under any circumstances.
Yeah, I've been going around the house for the last 3 days, singing the "Sometimes I Dream" that he, and my wife is like, what are you singing? And I'm like, that's just the soundtrack to my life, and it has always been. And your point about everyone being your dad. So Wilbon came on the podcast last week and did the old man yelling at cloud thing about how Michael's the greatest and the Warriors would never beat the Bulls. And, he got made fun of a little bit on Twitter for it. I will tell all the 20-year-olds who make fun of the 40-year-olds, like me, for not understanding what TikTok is and all of this, it's gonna happen to you too. In 20 years, the 20-year-olds are gonna be making fun of you for being the old, out-of-touch person. It's gonna happen to everyone. Anyway, so I was very excited that last night they got into the 92 and 93 finals and the first three-peat a little bit, because you were there for that first three-peat. You were on the ground in Chicago, working in the media, covering the team. You told me you're at every shoot-around, every practice. You're in Portland for the 92 finals. You're in Phoenix for the 93 finals. And that's going to lead us to the sort of debate everybody loves to have, like, what's the best Bulls team ever? But I want to step back before we get into that. I've been rewatching a lot of those two finals for podcast purposes in the last week or two. And I had forgot, like, in my head, the Portland series unfolded like a lot of the other finals where it was kind of it was an easier series for the Bulls. I had forgotten that was a 2-2 series going into Game 5. The Phoenix one, I remembered that the road team won every game except for one, and they had to go back to Phoenix to clinch. So I'll open it up to you. I don't know of those two playoff runs. I don't know if you have favorite memories, favorite practices, favorite conversations, a game or a scene that you will always stick with you, that's some of your favorite young Mike Greenberg memories.
So I'll start with this. For me, this is probably very personal, as opposed to bigger picture. But I'm a kid from New York who grew up with season tickets to the Knicks. My entire family is still in New York at that time, and there are no words to describe how important the Knicks were to my family, my parents at that time, and my brother. And I'm a reporter working in Chicago covering the Bulls. And as good as the series with Phoenix was, as interesting as the series with Portland was, the series against the Knicks starting in 91, but 92 and 93, and then 94 when Michael isn't there in the Hugh Holland series, were the most intensely competitive sporting events I've ever seen in my entire life. I've never seen teams like, I was a little bit surprised early in the Jordan films here that the vitriol remains between the Jordan teams and the bad boy Pistons, but seems to have largely disintegrated with the Knicks. Because I'm here to tell you that those series were every bit as competitive, every bit as vicious, as physical, as hotly contested. And a big part of it is Phil Jackson and Pat Riley hated each other. And that was awesome. They were rivals going all the way back to their playing days. And so, it went all the way to the coaches. So what I remember most were those games between the Knicks and the Bulls. Those, to me, were better than any of the finals games. The year, the 93 is the year that Starks has the left-handed dunk to win game 2. And it looks like, holy smoke, they're going to dethrone these guys. Jordan's going to lose. And the Knicks are going to win. And that was when the Dave Anderson columns comes out, and they just went through all of that, in which they make a big deal about Jordan going to Atlantic City. And he did. He legitimately stopped talking to us. Michael, who was the most accessible superstar you could ever imagine, who would stand there and talk to you until the cows went home. At that point, the cows went home because he did not talk to anybody for weeks. And that was it was just the most dramatic thing. And I guess I had such a personal stake in it because in those days, the big thing, and I guess it still is in basketball, was my family would never stop telling me, Jordan is getting every call. This is ridiculous. Michael, I can't even watch this. Jordan gets every single call. The league wants Jordan back in the finals so badly. And in Chicago, on my own radio station, the narrative was the league wants New York in the finals. They want the Knicks to make it. So it just goes to show you that depending upon which colored glasses you're wearing,
everyone's nuts.
Everyone's
nuts.
That was my favorite. That was a very long answer to a short question. Those were my favorite memories. Were those series between the Bulls and the Knicks was the most exciting, competitive, dramatic stuff I've ever watched.
So I would like to go back once when I have time, and I guess I have more time now because there are no games. I'd like to go back and watch the 92 series in the second round where the Knicks take them to 7. Only 2 game 7s the Bulls faced in the 6 title runs. Because I remember I haven't rewatched that series since. I remember at the time being astonished that the Knicks did that. Whereas in 93, the Knicks had made a couple of changes. They were a rising team. They were the 1 seed. They were ready. 93 was very clearly set up to be, if any team is going to dethrone the Bulls, it's this Knicks team. 92, I just remember being like, what is Xavier McDaniel doing? How is this happening? So what the hell happened in that series? And in game 7, obviously the Bulls blow them out and it's a non-game, but I just remember being like, how did this happen?
Well, I think that was when Pat Riley first figured out if you can't beat him, beat the hell out of him. And that's what they did. I mean, again, like the bad boy Pistons are remembered because history is written by and for the winners. So no one remembers those Knick teams because they didn't win anything. So only the hardcore Knick fans remember those teams. But the reality is the Knick teams were every bit as physical as the bad boy Pistons. They just weren't as dirty. The bad boy Pistons were dirty. I don't care what happened. Bale Lambier was a dirty player.
They own it now. They own it. They own that they were dirty.
Isaiah Thomas last week on my show tried to kind of talk his way around that a little bit. But they were dirty. The Knicks weren't as much dirty as they were just tough. And Pat Riley knew we're not as good as them. We're certainly not as good as that one guy is over there. But I got a bunch of guys who will just hold on to you and make them call a foul on literally every play. So when you look back at this, and even I hadn't remembered this stuff until I'm watching them, but as we're watching these highlights on Last Dance, and they pop up the final score, 87-79. You know, that's the middle of the third quarter in the NBA now. But that's how these games were ending. So in that way, like every basket mattered, like in a way that they don't now. Now, like, a 12-point lead is nothing in the NBA now because that's like 3 trips down the floor and 3 threes and we're right back there. In those days, like an 8-point run was the coach is calling a timeout and we have to talk here.
I think you just nailed why I think some people disliking the 3 is not about the 3. It's a little bit about the 3 and the fear of every team playing the same way and stylistic homogeneity and all that. I think part of it is that for better or worse, the 3 has done exactly what you just said. It's turned games less predictable. There are more runs. And Steve Kerr and I were talking about this before he came on my podcast. He's rewatching these games and he said, man, I'm watching these games and it's just such a slugfest. And it's bringing back all these memories for me. Steve is saying it's bringing back all these memories for me of being so stressed out for every possession. and every shot. And he said something to me. It's not on the podcast, but he said something like, I don't miss that. I like today's game so much better. And I think a lot of fans miss that because I think, like, I don't really watch college basketball anymore, but when I watch it, that's the feel you get in college basketball. And especially when the shot clock was even longer, is that every single one of these possessions is critical. And the NBA of the 90s with the emphasis of the three was sort of closer to a middle ground between the NBA now and that feeling in college basketball. And I think when people lament the three, part of it is that they lament that feeling having gone away, the feeling that every possession was like a life or death matter.
Correct. So there's two separate groups of people, I think, who hate the three. The first, this is my second reference to my father in this conversation, would be people like him. And we can reference him all we want because no one his age knows what a podcast is anyway. But my father would always say, Michael, this is not what basketball was intended to be. The intention of the game, the entire reason, the way you play the sport is to pass the ball until you get the best possible shot as close to the basket as you possibly can. This notion of trying to set up a shot from as far away as you possibly can is the opposite of what the game was intended to be. There are those people. You're never convincing them otherwise. Then there are the people who I think agree with what would look at it more the way you're talking about it, is that if you watch college, I watch college basketball primarily because I watch my school, Northwestern, play college basketball. Every time the ball goes in the basket, it's an occurrence for either side. Like something important just happened. And in the NBA, that just isn't the way it is. And so there is a removal. Now, what you have gotten in its place is a level of graceful acrobats that were not allowed, that either couldn't do then or weren't able to do then what they're able to do now because someone would have shoved them into the second row. And you're getting the ability to score. You get guys who are 6'11" who can shoot from where they're shooting from, that they would have been like from another planet at the time that we're talking about. And so baskets just aren't an occurrence in a game anymore. Huge dunks aren't an occurrence in a game anymore. The reason Michael Jordan's dunks seemed more spectacular than even a spectacular dunk in an NBA game today is because there were only three of them. Like, we remember them all because they were fairly few and far between. There are a never-ending array of plays now that would have been the biggest highlight of the season back in 1992. And it isn't necessarily, for me, it isn't necessarily better or worse, but it is most certainly different.
Well, Chris Mullin, in talking about Game 7 in 1998 between the Pacers and the Bulls, the other Game 7, Chris Mullin gave me a great quote for that story. He said, Scottie Pippen just basically beat the shit out of Mark Jackson up and down the court. And he's not bitter about it. He's just said that was legal then. Scottie could do that, and Phil was really smart to put him on Mark Jackson and just say, whatever the refs let you get away with, do that as long as you can. And the Pacers aren't mad about it. They said that's the way it was. So 92, well, look, 93 is, we talked about that Knicks team being set up to beat them, and that's the Charles Smith stuffed 4 times in a row game. I said on my podcast with Mike Breen a few weeks ago, that's one of the most consequential games in the NBA in the last 30 years, because as you said very eloquently on the show last week when I was on, it matters that he three-peated twice, because that's separate. The three-peat separates him from Magic and Larry and Isaiah and LeBron and the Spurs. It's just who never repeated. It's just a separator. And that was one of the moments when the first three-peat was really, really in doubt. And for them to go win that game in New York, and I had forgotten that he had 54 in Game 4 to even the same. But that's just, he's putting up 50 in playoff games like once every 2 weeks. It's ridiculous. That game, I'm sorry for Knicks fans. I loved Sue Bird's cameo in the documentary last night. Like, I don't care if Horace Grant was really the one that got dunked on. Starks dunked on Michael. That game, that's a top 5 pivotal moment in the NBA in the last 30 years.
Yeah, Michael, we never really saw him lose. Once he figured, so the way this stuff used to work in the NBA, and I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I'm assuming there are a lot of younger people listening to this conversation who don't know and maybe are learning this by watching Last Dance, is that you would have to serve an apprenticeship. Like you would have to go through a little period of time where you would work your way up and you would knock on that door, and you saw the Pistons doing it with the Celtics. They couldn't beat them. They couldn't beat them. They finally beat them. They became the champs. The Bulls did the same thing with the Pistons, worked their way up, couldn't beat them. And then eventually the Bulls finally beat them and they went on a run. That team never lost. Jordan retires after 93. He's not there in 94. He only played 17 games in 95. He wasn't wearing the same jersey number. It just wasn't the same. So in some ways, you don't look at it as lost. Then he comes back and they keep winning. He wins all three again, and then he leaves. He never comes back. He comes back as a wizard, 2 years later, and he's 40 years old, and it's sort of like watching, Frank Sinatra when he was in his 80s, and you're just excited that he can still hit some of the notes. You're not expecting him to hit all of them anymore. So what we got to see Larry Bird lose. We got to see Magic Johnson lose. Those guys all walked off the court losing their last game. Michael Jordan walked off the court winning his last game. When last seen, the Michael Jordan we're actually talking about was stealing the ball from Karl Malone, who's the second leading scorer in the history of the NBA, with the kind of play that, who the hell does that? Like, who fakes running on defense, then turns around, comes back behind him, and steals the ball in the final seconds of a championship situation, then runs up the floor and makes that shot with his hand in the air? It's an uncanny and impossible command for the dramatic.
It's not only that. I haven't rewatched that game in the last few weeks, but I believe he has 6 points in the final 50 seconds of that game. He has a baseline drive where he draws a foul, then he has like a leaning layup, and then he has the steal and the shot. So it's not even that sequence is an iconic all-time sequence, but it's the two baskets before that. He literally just takes the game. Like Utah's ahead, and Michael just says, by myself, I'm taking the game, and we win the championship, and that's it.
So the two reasons that I can't compare what's going on now to that is that guys keep jumping around to play together. I have no problem with it. I don't in any way begrudge them doing it. God bless them. If I were in their shoes, I'd probably do the same thing. But what you are robbed in that is seeing the evolution of a championship team. So when LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh got together in Miami, they went from 0 to 60 immediately. You didn't see them knocking on the door of anybody. They just went from irrelevant to in the finals in 1 year, and then every single year. And then LeBron leaves and he goes to Cleveland, and they're in the finals every single year. And Kevin Durant goes from Oklahoma City to Golden State, and they're just going to win the championship, and there isn't going to be anything to be said about it. And they obviously would right now be three-time defending champs if they hadn't been ravaged by injury, particularly with Durant. But in those days, you would actually see the evolution of it, and Jordan never lost. So to me, it's a combination of the 2 3-peats plus the fact that once he started winning, we never saw him lose. So every time one of the others to whom he is compared wound up losing, and LeBron has lost a lot in the biggest spots, most of it not his fault. But that's the easiest way to say, well, you know what? Michael Jordan just never freaking lost. I mean, no matter what happened, that guy wasn't going to lose. And that's a very tough thing to compete against.
Scott's Turf Builder Triple Action has acquired the secret to building a thicker, greener lawn. In return, they have taken all of the hard work out of the picture, that's good, to give you more time to do nothing extra. People don't realize that it's easy to get the lawn of their dreams by simply feeding their lawn a few times throughout the year. Scott's Turf Builder Action kills weeds, prevents crabgrass, yucca, and feeds to build thick, green lawns. With Scott's Turf Builder Triple Action, you can finally get the lawn you've always dreamt of. Scott's Turf Builder Triple Action will give your yard the nourishment it needs to help your weak, thin lawn recover. Who wants a weak, thin lawn? When you feed with Scott's Turf Builder Triple Action multiple times throughout the year, your grass will be greener, stronger, more resilient. Pick up a bag today. This is a Scott's yard. Also, Scott's no quibble money back guarantee states if you're not satisfied, you can get your money back. That's good. This is a Scott's yard. Let's go back to 92 because I want to just have the debate now of what is the best Jordan championship team. And I think the debate for most people probably crystallizes between 92 and 96. 92, they go 67-15. It's by far the best record of the first 3-peat team. So this is the middle 3-peat team in 3-peat number 1. Interestingly, their playoff record is 15-7, which is the most losses of any of the 6 playoff teams. But if you look at the murderer's row they faced in the last 3 rounds of those playoffs, It's the 51-win Knicks team that takes them to 7. It's a 57-win Cavs team in the conference finals. And it's a 63-win Blazers team in the finals. It's an absolute murderer's row. And so the 7 losses, we can chalk that up however you want. 96, obviously they go 72-10. It's the only year that they rank first in both offense and defense. They have the biggest net rating in the history of the NBA that season. A couple points bigger than in 92. They go 15-3 in the playoffs, but they go through a 47-win Knicks team in the second round. 60-win Magic team missing Horace Grant, Brian Shaw, and then at the end of the series, Nick Anderson. And then Phoenix, and then Seattle, who was really good. And then Seattle, who was really good. So that's a soft playoff run compared to 92. So we can dissect, and I think the 97 team, which goes 69-13, is a little slept on, but well, take it for, what's your answer? We can get into the specifics, but I think for most people, it's going to come down to 92 and 96, with 97 getting a little bit of love on the side. It's a really hard debate. It really, really is. So give me your take. I know where you fall, but let's spell it out.
So I am a big proponent in greatest versus best. So the greatest of the Bulls teams is the 96 team. They should have been 15-1. They went up 3-0 on Seattle in those finals. I have no recollection of how the hell Seattle won 2 games, but I can tell you they were meaningless. Not one person, and you're obviously old enough to remember this, not one person in or outside of Chicago thought for a second they weren't going to win.
0 people.
So they could easily have been 15-1 in those playoffs, and you got to give them their due. They went 72-10. Jordan was so motivated. Rodman was so re-energized by being in this situation. They're the greatest, but the 92 team to me would beat them. So that makes them the best. If you could somehow magically have, and some of the people are the same. I mean, the coach is the same. Jordan and Pippen are the same people. But if you could have the 92 team play the 96 team, I would bet on the 92 team, and here's why. There are a few reasons, but the single biggest reason is this. When he came back from playing baseball, so 96, 97, and 98 for those championships, Michael Jordan was the best player in the NBA, and there was no question of it. The first three-peat, Michael Jordan was the greatest player that ever lived. He was better then than he was when he came back, if only because he was younger and any number of other reasons. He was more physically dynamic. He learned a lot of things. He had a lot of little tricks of the trade that he had developed over the course of years that he used in 96, 97, 98, posted up a lot more. He played the game a little differently. This is by no means to take anything away from him. He remained the best player in the NBA. But the best player I've ever seen in my life was Jordan in 91, 92, 93. He was ridiculous. And he alone would have won that series if they had played each other, if somehow that were possible. So I would start with that. The second is, and I'm so glad he said this, I had Charles Barkley on Get Up, and I asked him about this, and he said Horace Grant was tougher to beat than Dennis Rodman. Now, I didn't have the guts. I was on another podcast here with Stu Gatz a couple of weeks ago before this started airing to preview it. And I said, look, when push comes to shove, I guess you have to give Rodman his due as being better than Horace, even though it hurt me to say it because I liked Horace Grant so much when I covered him, and I think he was so overlooked. And Rodman got disproportionate attention in the positive, and I think Horace got disproportionate attention in the negative, to the detriment. But I think Horace Grant did a lot of things on the floor that Dennis Rodman did not. So, and the pieces they moved in and around them, who were sort of interchangeable over the course of time, Paxson and Kerr and Longley and Wennington versus Cartwright and Purdue. A lot of that I'm going to call a wash, if only because it's kind of hard to remember which ones you really think are better. So if based only on the fact that in 1992, Michael Jordan was the single best basketball player that ever lived, I'll take that team in a series against the other one solely for that reason.
So Horace Grant at his peak was like a 14-10 guy who was a really smart player in the triangle, knew the spots, knew how to cut, really good defensive player. So I get that. I get all that. And you're absolutely right about Michael. Michael 91 to 93 is like just on another planet. He's a different species of player. He goes in the lane and jumps and just the world stops. There's just nothing. There's nothing anybody can do. Like, and these are the best players. This is Clyde Drexler, Terry Porter, whoever you want to put on them. They just look like Lilliputians on the ground, and this person is soaring above them. He's just on another planet. So a lot of this 92 versus 96 argument, to me, just comes down to how much do you value other planet, other species Michael Jordan versus just the best of a normal species Michael Jordan. Because the Horace versus Dennis argument is a little reductive to me because it's not just Horace versus Dennis. I think the 96 team is actually deeper. And because Horace Grant really, when he becomes Dennis Rodman, but also becomes Tony Kukoc. Tony Kukoc becomes the 13, 14 point a game scorer with much more long range shooting, much more playmaking, and you have Rodman in that role. And I kind of like, I like the versatility and complementary skill sets of the Ron Harper, Steve Kerr guard platoon, whereas BJ Armstrong and Paxson are kind of are similar guys. They're outside shooters who are kind of liabilities on defense, although they were pests. I like that they could go, like when they had Harper, Jordan, Pippen, Rodman on the floor, you just couldn't do anything on offense. You couldn't score on them. So I think that team is a little bit deeper. I also think they're a little bit more modern and versatile. Like when they put Kerr, Jordan, Pippen, Rodman, Kukoc, so Rodman's playing center, that teams in 1998 were like, wow, what the hell is going on here? Whereas you look at 92, they're playing like Cartwright and Scott Williams together. They're playing Horace Grant, Cliff Livingston, and Cartwright together. They were just all in on being an old school, huge, giant team. Whereas the 96 team, I think, is a little bit deeper and could go stylistically a little bit differently. But MJ was on another universe, from another universe in the first one. And Scotty was a little bit younger too. So the other thing about 96 that's interesting to me, and Simmons brings this up all the time, expansion season, so the 72 wins is a little bit diluted. That's the year the Raptors and the Grizzlies come in. So there's more easy pickings. It's a weak league. On the flip side, there's so much analysis of this time in the NBA, and people forget for 3 seasons from 95 to 97, they moved the 3-point line in, and it like dramatically changed the game. So if you look at Michael and Scotty's, stats, like something like 35 to 40% of Michael's made 3-pointers come in 2 seasons. And Scotty, similarly, it's like a disproportionate amount. The NBA, in effect, gave them a weapon that they didn't have by moving the 3-point line in a couple of feet. And I think that compensates a little bit for the aging and declined athleticism. Like, Michael made 100 threes 2 seasons in a row. In 92, he made 27 threes. And if you watch game 1 of that finals, which is the shrug game, when he makes 6 threes and a half, Marv Albert is like, astonished that he's even shooting any threes. Clyde Drexler is defending Michael Jordan in that game like teams defend Ben Simmons now. It's like, you just go ahead, buddy. Go ahead and shoot. It's insane. So I think the moving the 3-point line in gave Michael and Scotty a tool that wasn't really in their toolbox, which made the 96 Bulls a little bit more not versatile, but just is another thing they could do.
You're making a very interesting case. I someone who I've not seen practically any of in The Last Dance so far was one of my favorite people to be around during those runs. Everyone talks about Tex Winter because of the triangle offense. They had an assistant coach named Johnny Bach, who was an NBA lifer. BACH was his name. And he was around the league for 1 trillion years. And Tex was the offense and Bach was the defense. And when he would put Jordan, Pippen, Rodman, and Harper on the floor, he called it the Doberman defense. And they would go out there and they would just attack you. And that's something I really have not thought a lot about. You know, here's what I would say, Zach, is that sometimes your emotion gets involved. I will admit that in that 95-96 team, I was put off by the Rodman thing. Rodman, I felt, came in there. He became such a sensation in town. Like, I'll tell you a very quick story about it. I don't know how well you know Chicago, but they have these expressways, 4 primary expressways that are your way of getting in and out of the city. And in downtown, when you're driving down the expressway to get in from like the northern suburbs into the downtown area in Chicago called the Loop, which is where I lived, there was this huge mural that was off to the side, and they painted this huge mural of Dennis Rodman. And it was stopping traffic. People were stopping their cars, getting out on the expressway, stopping and taking pictures of the Dennis Rodman mural. Like, I don't know if these were tourists or what it was, but they had to send police there to keep moving traffic along, and eventually had to take the mural down because it was actually impacting traffic. And there was a part of me that felt, and again, I was there, I was covering it, that Rodman was getting people were acting like this was now Rodman's team.
Wow.
No one really knew what they were talking about. But I don't mean to say people thought Rodman's now the better player than Jordan. No one who had ever seen a basketball game thought that. But people were so fascinated by him and loved him. And there was always a part of that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, because I just found him to be such an attention-seeking person. Like he cared much more about being famous and promoting himself than he cared about winning. I don't care what anybody said. Now, it doesn't mean he wasn't a great player. He was absolutely a great player. And you've seen pretty good stuff. That episode 3, I think it was, or whichever one it was, where they really talked a lot about how smart he was. He was a tremendous player. I take nothing away from him. But boy, did he suck the air out of a room. And it was all about Dennis. And I think something about that has always kind of rubbed me the wrong way, which is why I've always wanted to stick up for Horace Grant, who was a great player, B, a great teammate, who felt as though he didn't get nearly enough attention and credit for what they were achieving, but didn't behave himself the way Dennis did in order to try and get all of that attention. And I think there's always been a part of me that has liked that better. But I'd forgotten the one I forgot really is Harper. Harper is an incredibly important part of that second team, because there's no way to compare what John Paxson and B.J. Armstrong did to what Ron Harper was able to do. If you want to say Paxson and Kerr kind of X each other out as just outstanding outside shooters, and Kerr is a better pure shooter than Paxson was. Paxson hit a bunch of very big shots, particularly in the first championship series, and the third one he makes the famous one to beat Phoenix. But I'd forgotten about Harper. Harper's presence kind of skews this a little bit. You're making me rethink this. I'm going to stand on my pick, because I refuse not to, based upon my personal feelings, but you're kind of talking me out of it.
Well, I think 92 probably wins in a poll. If you polled like 1,000 people who are around the NBA, then I think the 92 team probably wins. Also, in this theoretical game, if it's one game for all the marbles or whatever, you just play all your best players 46 minutes. So your Stacey Kings and your Scott Williams, although Scott Williams, talk about a guy, I'm rewatching all these old games. That dude was constantly doing helpful stuff. I see why Phil liked him. He's just coming into games like there's an offensive rebound here, put back here, a little short jumper. He was just in the right place doing the right stuff all the time. So I think 92 probably wins in a poll, just for the reason of 45 minutes of other universe Jordan and 45 minutes of prime athletic Pippen is just, it's something you can't do anything with. 96 to me, the 72 wins matters. The fact that they got the 72 wins matters. The fact that they destroyed everyone in the playoffs, even if it was a soft playoff run until the Sonics won the 2 meaningless games. It's meaningless is strong. Apologies to the Seattle people, but you're right. Once it's 3-0, no one in the universe thinks this is a series anymore. And the Kukoc, by the way, Kukoc better be in this documentary as something other than like a dude who got picked on in the Olympics, because Kukoc was a 6th man of the year. Michael and Scotty both grew to love him. And I just think his playmaking, shooting, size element is something that original team didn't have. Like, the guys coming off the bench for that 92 team are essentially all big guys and another guard and another little guard. It's just all a bunch of bruisers. They didn't have anyone like Kukoc. So I'm like, I'm because of the 72 and the versatility, I might lean a little to 96, but I bet 92 wins in a poll. And about Rodman, the 97 team that went 69-13, they go 15-4 in the playoffs. They beat a 56-win Hawks team, a 61-win Heat team, and a 64-win Utah team, who are 2nd, 4th, and 5th in net rating in the NBA that year. That is a murderer's row. But the primary argument against them, if there is one, is that Rodman checked out in the 97 play. It was not nearly the same guy as he was in 96 and 98. But that was 69 and 13. That's one hell of a team.
Which was the year that Rodman, I'm doing all of this off the top of my head, which was the year that Rodman kicked the cameraman in the ding ding and wound up being suspended for a significant period of time? Not the trip to Vegas, but he got suspended for a significant stretch of time. He was always a person who was right
97.
On the edge. That was that one. I think that's the point I was going. I feel like that might have sort of carried over into that because it was if you remember the play, there's one of these camera guys who were like literally on the court shooting the game, and he's in a very, very vulnerable position. He's like squatted down, his legs are apart, and Rodman sort of falls into him and may have it might have hurt a little bit. There's certainly no one else's fault, and he just kicks him right in the private area, and he got suspended for it and significantly deserved it. Rodman was he was a pain in the neck. I found him to be a pain in the neck. And that actually brings me to something else I wanted to talk about with you briefly. So I gave this some thought. I said, Zach wants to be on the podcast. What can I tell him? If there's one thing I've come to believe watching The Last Dance, it is that Phil Jackson is underappreciated as a coach. Phil Jackson, I can tell you, was underappreciated then. People in town did not. I worked for the All Sports radio station. We would just take calls all day long talking about the Bulls. That was basically 5 months of programming, 3 years in a row, nonstop calls. Phil would not come on the station because he felt that he was constantly being disrespected. That people were constantly, callers and the hosts were constantly disrespecting him, basically with the suggestion that the Bulls were a product of Michael Jordan's greatness and that anyone could roll the ball out there, that they had thrown Doug Collins out the door right when he would have gotten them there anyway. And Doug was a figure in town that a lot of people liked, and that Phil got this job, and that Phil was just lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And he had these legendary, experienced assistant coaches we just talked about in Tex Winter and Johnny Bach. And that Phil did not get a lot of credit. And as I watch this thing, and you look at how hard it is to keep the great teams together. Like, no one does it. It's impossible to do. And with all of the insanity that surrounded that group, and they really were like the Beatles, some of the stuff that he did, I mean, it worked. You just can't argue it. It worked. And the best example of it ever is the vacation that he gives Rodman in the middle of the season. Who the hell does that? Who the hell says to a player, yeah, you need, a long weekend in the middle of the season to go to Vegas with Carmen Electra and just engage in nonstop debauchery and then just come on back and hopefully with your head cleared and ready to play? No one would do that. But Phil Jackson figured out that he needed to do that. I think Phil's finger on the pulse of that group, sort of hand in hand with Michael's leadership, are the reason they would have won some championships anyway, but they wouldn't have won every one of them. Phil is a big part of the reason they won every one of them.
Well, it's not just giving Rodman the vacation. It's knowing the other players on the team well enough to know that this is not going to fracture the team, that there won't be so much bitterness about, well, why is this guy getting to do this and I don't get to do this? And you see Michael's annoyed at like vacation. If anyone deserves a fucking vacation, it's me. That's what he says in the doc. But knowing that the group will be able to do that. The Phil thing is interesting because a lot of it comes down to how synonymous he is with the triangle. And, was it Van Gundy or Riley? They called him Big Chief Triangle, and like everyone sort of made fun of the triangle because, is it the triangle or is it Michael and Scotty? Is it the triangle or is it Shaq and Kobe? Well, obviously it's the players. The players make the system, but I do, and people want to reimagine this like, well, what if you just let Michael run 50 pick and rolls a game with shooting around him? And you see glimpses of it. Particularly in some of the finals games I was watching, you'll see him. He knows every pass out of the pick and roll. He knows how to play that way. And I do think the mythology of changing Michael's game and elevating his teammates is a big part of the Bulls' journey. It's a reason why they won maybe it helped. I bet it helped. I do think there's something to everyone feeling involved on offense motivates them to play defense. That's the thing that coaches and players tell you a lot. Even if I'm just moving and cutting and touching the ball and passing it over here, I'm a part of it. I'm not just standing around like PJ Tucker in the corner. I'm a part of it. And that makes me motivated to play on the other end. But the game back then was also just not, the triangle was a very effective offense for the way the game was back then, by which I mean everyone's playing two traditional big men, 3 or 4 guys who can't shoot threes. There just isn't anything equivalent to the current spacing of the court. And in that era, the triangle, I think, was an effective way to play. But I think a lot of the reason why maybe you're right about Phil being underappreciated is, I'm not sure if that's true, but if you have that opinion, I think a lot of it is Phil in the triangle just became so synonymous that the analysis of Phil Jackson as a coach was only about the triangle, whether the triangle was overblown or a real thing or not, and not about all of this other stuff. And even last night in the doc, Michael goes to play golf with Ron Harper, and he's like, Phil gets it. Phil knows we need it. Another coach would have had us practice today, but Phil's letting us play golf and blow off some steam. And if you're talking about keeping teams together, you're right that we've seen them all fall apart due to age or egos or I get sick of this coach or this coach gets sick of me. The Bulls fell apart because of management, and not just Jerry Krause. Jerry Reinsdorf is getting a total pass during this whole documentary because Krause is a schlubby looking dude with a cantankerous personality, so he's easy to blame. Management decided we're done with this team. And I said this on one of my podcasts recently. I do think, Michael was 35, Dennis was 37, I think. They're getting up there. Scotty's 33. But Kevin Pelton, I think, has a piece coming out this week on .com projecting what a healthy Bulls team would have been able to do in 1999 had Michael not hurt his finger cutting a cigar, which, by the way, that's insane too. He had a cigar cutting injury and then he retired. And his conclusion is they were probably going to be a 60-win team again that year. And I do think there is something to, you just play it out until you lose. Like Michael said, the honor of being a champion, you just get to play it out until you lose. And I do think it's not hyperbole to suggest that the Jerrys kind of dishonored the tradition of what a championship team is supposed to be allowed to do.
I don't disagree with that. I will say, however, the degree to which they became iconic and legendary might in the long run have been fueled by them having been broken up involuntarily and before their time.
Before they lost.
I mean, again, we never saw them lose. So in our mind's eye, I'm going to make a ridiculous analogy, but in your mind's eye, like John Lennon, who is my personal favorite musical artist of all time, will always be young. And he will always have just written all those songs. And we will never get to see what his life would have been. Is it better? Of course it's not better. It is a freaking horrific tragedy, one of the greatest ones in the history of the entertainment genre, that John Lennon was assassinated when he was 40 years old. But the result of it is that you have no other image of him. It never existed. We never saw Michael Jordan's teams lose. We never saw them lose. The NBA also went an entirely different direction after that. So they could, I'm doing this from memory, but they couldn't have won 60 games in 1999 because they didn't even play 60 games.
Well,
right?
the equivalent of a 60-win pace.
But like that season will always have like a little bit of a weird asterisk to it, right? Like I remember Phil Jackson would always kind of downplay that because he started winning with the Lakers the next year, and he would always kind of say, well, that one year, but that didn't really count. Like there's something in its own way. If all this stuff is just a story anyway, if all this stuff is just some gigantic piece of dramatic entertainment, then having this unusual ending with these perfectly written, perfectly cast villains is sort of a nice way to end it. Nobody ever beat Michael Jordan. They took it away from him. They didn't let him keep going. They didn't let him keep trying. And the same can be said of Phil too. Phil contributed to that also, because I think Phil 100% united his players against the common enemy that was Jerry Krause. And I think that's one of the reasons that Krause hated Phil so much, is that Phil was fueling the anti-Jerry sentiment amongst the players Not I think maliciously, but because I think he recognized it as a way of uniting them against a common enemy or in a common cause. And, that's the oldest trick in the book, and I think Phil used it effectively. And I think that, more than anything, was the root of the discord between those two guys. I think Jerry's feeling was, I gave you this. Like, you were coaching the Albany Patroons in the CBA. I put you on this bench. I gave you the head coaching job when Doug Collins was obviously doing great and we were on a positive trajectory. Here you are now, your Big Chief triangle, and now you're sort of secretly sowing the seeds of discord and letting these guys disrespect me in front of me, call me crumbs to my face on the bus and not do anything about it. That's not great co-parenting. And I think, to look at it that way, and like Jerry Krause, I think he had a point there. But to go back to Phil, one of the reasons I think that we associate Phil so much with the triangle is a little bit of not revisionist history, but the triangle doesn't work anymore for all the reasons you just described. And Phil came to New York in a very high-profile way and refused to acknowledge it and made everything about the triangle. So the triangle was not a dirty word in the NBA when it was winning championships. The triangle won 11 championships in the NBA in a span of whatever that wound up being, 14 years, whatever it was. So the triangle was not a negative thing. It was a perfect thing for what it was. It was of its time and of its era, and the game has changed. There's no reason to discredit what Phil did then because they were running the triangle. It was the perfect offense for its era and for its talent. The reason we look on it so negatively, at least in part, I believe, is because he tried to jam it down the throat of absolutely everyone in New York, in and outside of the Knicks organization, and it wound up being his undoing there and set back that franchise and just generally made a lot of people cranky.
For e-commerce business, shipping in 2 days or less is the new standard. As a growing business, how can you keep up? Introducing Shippo, your business's new secret weapon. Shippo is the only shipping software for growing businesses that you can start today, set up in minutes, and ship today. Because they ship hundreds of millions of packages, Shippo's volume discounts save you up to 90% off carrier rates. Simply connect your online store to Shippo, no coding or technical expertise required at all. They will instantly identify the lowest shipping rates from 55 plus top global carriers like UPS, the Postal Service, FedEx, DHL, all those things. Your orders are automatically pulled in and ready to go. Just click, print, ship. Plus, automated return labels are free. You only pay if your customers actually use them. Companies that use Shippo save thousands of dollars, free up hours of valuable time, and on average grow 77% year over year. Just over 100,000 companies like Goat, Hims, MeUndies are saving up to 90% off carrier rates with Shippo. For our listeners, Shippo is offering their best discount available anywhere. Get a shipping consultation and Shippo Pro Plan 6-month trial for free at goshippo.com/low, my last name, the name of this podcast. That's up to a $700 value for free at goshippo.com/low. Go right now and get your shipping consultation and Shippo Pro Plan 6-month trial for free at goshippo.com/low. Let me ask you this, because you were there. I was texting with a friend of mine in basketball who's about my age last night, and she was saying, I don't remember the gambling thing being something that my friends and I talked about when it was happening. And I said, same with me. I was 15. Media was different then. I wasn't reading Dave Anderson regularly in the New York Times. Maybe I was. I just don't remember it being something my buddies and I talked about at the time. We talked about the finals. We talked about the Knicks and the Bulls. We talked about all the basketball stuff. I don't remember the gambling penetrating our discussion. So obviously I know about it now. I've read about it. I know all about it, but I'm just, for someone who's now is working in the media at that time and covering that team, obviously it was a big deal. He stops talking to you. There's all this talk in the documentary about whether his reputation is tarnished. I actually don't think it's tarnished at all. I think people kind of find the gambling thing charming. I mean, they don't know the stories of the wise guys he's losing money to and all the trial stuff. When you're in the media then and you're talking about it with your colleagues and you're talking about it with people in the Bulls and you hear David Stern talking about it, how big of a crisis was it? Was there a sense that like the sky actually could be falling here, or was it something that you could shove aside and focus on the basketball?
There are and continue to be people whose opinions I value who believe Michael Jordan was suspended from the NBA and that's why he left after 93 because of the gambling. I don't even like saying this next part out loud, but it is a fact that there are people who in public, not behind closed doors, but on airwaves at the time, speculated as to whether or not his gambling was part of the reason his father was killed. Those are facts. Those things happened. Those things were said. They were wondered aloud. I myself do not believe them. I believe that Michael Jordan in 93, after having won the title in 91, won it again in 92, didn't want to go to the Olympics, but it was the dream team. The NBA and Nike were never going to let him not go. So he winds up spending his whole summer playing again in 92, then comes back and wins it again in grueling fashion in 93. I believe he was fried emotionally, psychologically, mentally, physically, and otherwise. His father then is tragically and purely coincidentally killed in a random act of violence and robbery. And the combination of those things cause him, Michael, to just come apart mentally. And he just decides, I can't deal with it, and he needs to get away. And he needed that period of time away. That's what I've always believed, and barring someone showing me some evidence to the contrary, that's what I will always believe. But if you're asking me how big a deal was the gambling, it was big enough that there were people who it was not whispered. It was something people would openly talk about. Do you believe Michael Jordan was suspended surreptitiously by the NBA and by David Stern because of gambling and because of connection to unsavory people? And is it possible that connection to unsavory people was connected to his father's murder? So I think that's the best answer I can give you. These were not just crackpot theorists like people saying, oh, the league wants to make sure they win, so they've bought the refs. Like this was stuff that people genuinely believed. So I don't think you could be a bigger deal than that.
I'm just saying pre-retirement. So during those playoff series when it comes out, so it's a crisis then. It's a crisis like in that moment. It's something that is a huge part of the discussion. I just don't.
Let's be clear on what we're talking about. The Dave Anderson column was written about Michael Jordan going to Atlantic City.
That's true. It's a discreet
the night
event.
Before a game, and apparently was there until some very, very late hour of the morning. Now, in the documentary recently, whenever this episode aired, I remember Michael saying he was back in his hotel by like 2 a.m. or something.
Even earlier.
I don't believe that to be true. I believe, again, I'm doing so much of this from memory, but at least I believe the way Dave Anderson wrote it, he was gambling there until like 4 a.m. That column was really the narrative that emerged from that was less about Jordan's gambling and his connection to unsavory characters than it was to his commitment. Than it was the notion that he let his team down and let everybody else down by doing that. And that's what made him mad, and that's why he stopped speaking to the media. It wasn't because of the gambling. It wasn't because of Richard Esquinas or the millions of dollars he was supposedly losing on the golf course and other places all the time, because that's not stuff people really knew. Maybe there were some people who knew it, but I didn't know it. That is not something that was commonly talked about on the radio, and it was not something that the people I talked to regularly, inside or outside of the sports media, were talking about regularly. So that became a bigger deal when he retired, at least in my consciousness. Prior to that, the big deal that David Anderson wrote about, I interpreted as Michael feeling that his integrity as a player, as a champion, as a competitor was being assailed.
The other thing that's a little too convenient in the telling for me now is the level of plausible deniability that both Michael Jordan and Rod Thorne have given themselves in discussing why Isaiah Thomas was left off the Dream Team. So they do it. They recount the conversation in last night's episode, and Rod Thorne calls Michael, say, we're doing the Dream Team. Michael says, well, who's playing? Who's playing? And Rod says, well, the guy you're referring to is not going to be playing. So Michael gets to say, well, I never brought him up. All I did was ask who was playing. His name was never mentioned, and then this thing was said. That seems a little too convenient. I'm just because I don't know what happened, but that seems a little too convenient to me.
There is zero question but that Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen did not want Isaiah on the Dream Team, and thus he wasn't. There is zero question in my mind of that. No one will ever convince me otherwise. And I will say this. I do have a problem with it because you can love or hate Isaiah Thomas all you want. And he's another one who, through the eyes now of more recent history, looks totally different, right? Because his post-playing career has been filled with a variety of, I guess for lack of a more poetic phrase, of failures, and then obviously the terrible situation that took place in the front office with the Knicks. None of that had happened in 1992 when they were making those decisions. Isaiah Thomas, in my view, was 100% of the stature and closer to his prime than Larry Bird was to have been a part of that team, and deserves to have been a part of that team. And leaving him off that team because of personality dispute or dislike or whatever it is, in my opinion, is really not fair. That team, even then, everyone knew that that team meant something and that it was always going to mean something, that the people who were on that team would always be remembered as having been Dream Teamers first and foremost. I mean, you look at that picture of that thing, there's no more iconic photo in sports. It is the greatest team and most important team in the history of organized sports. And to leave Isaiah off because he froze Jordan out of the All-Star game in 1984, which I think is what made Michael really upset. I think it was much more about that than it was about the handshake in 91.
Interesting.
I think it was that. That's where it began, and I think that's where the seeds of that dislike were sown. I think it is unfair because whether you can hate Isaiah Thomas all you want, but he was an unbelievably great player. He was absolutely of a stature with all of the players on that team in historical greatness, in my opinion. And he deserved to be on the Dream Team.
And by the way, as tough as they come, and not just in the sense of he's part of the bad boys and they're all tough, in the sense of play through injury, go at anyone. His Game 6 in the 88 finals on one ankle is one of the great all-time big spotlight performances in the NBA.
I've said this before, and I respect your opinion greatly. I would love to hear your answer. If you separate the NBA into a variety of categories, and one of them is the little man, so you've got the truly little guy. So I'm not comparing Isaiah Thomas to, even though they both play guard, I'm not comparing Isaiah Thomas to Magic Johnson or to Jason Kidd or to people like that. I'm talking about the guys who were 6 feet tall and under or something like that. So it's something in that neighborhood. So that would include now, and Steph Curry is taller than that, but I'll even put him in the discussion. Steph Curry, Allen Iverson, Steve Nash, John Stockton, Tiny Archibald. Who am I forgetting?
Jerry West. Jerry West
did I say Iverson?
Jerry West is 6'2". Jerry West was 6'2", but played a little bigger than that.
Bigger. I don't think of him as a little guy.
Yeah, when I looked up his height the other day, I was like, wow, he's 6'2". He seems like 6'5" to me somehow.
Of all of them that I saw, so West is before my time, but of all of them that I saw, I would take Isaiah Thomas over any of them. I would take Isaiah over any of those players. It's impossible to compare eras. Steph is doing stuff now that no one has ever done in the history of the game. I get that Nash was the MVP of the league in consecutive years. I get that Iverson is a beloved figure for a variety of very, very legitimate reasons. There was an aura about him that maybe no other player I can ever think of had. But if your objective when you step foot on a basketball court is to win, I would take Isaiah Thomas. You can have whichever one of them you want, and my team is going to beat your team.
I think Curry has already passed him, and I hear what you're saying about eras and skill sets and all that. I think Curry has already passed him. But yeah, no, prime Isaiah, and like he had a traumatic injury, Achilles tear at the end of his career. Career is kind of cut short. He had left it by age 32. We never got a late prime Isaiah Thomas, really. And I think that affects the way people remember. I mean, even by 92, when the Dream Team is happening, he's on the severe downslope of his career. I think John Stockton at that point was probably better than Isaiah, but that's just because of where Isaiah was in his career path. But yeah, prime Isaiah from, early 80s to 90 was as good as any little guy.
See, here's the thing about, I know that everyone listening to this is going to lose their minds. I'm not suggesting that Isaiah Thomas is better than, what I'm saying is that Steph Curry is playing in a different sport. To compare the
That's
game
true.
Steph Curry is playing at his size to the game Isaiah Thomas played at his size is an unreasonable comparison. I mean, for folks who are watching The Last Dance, you're seeing what I'm talking about. That was in an era where everyone was a foot taller than he was, where everyone was playing in a compressed little area down by the paint. When Isaiah Thomas started playing in the NBA, the three-point shot didn't exist. So he didn't grow up taking threes. He never learned to shoot a three because there wasn't such thing as a three. So if Isaiah Thomas had played at a time, well, I'm not suggesting he would have been as great a shooter as Steph. Steph Curry is inarguably the greatest shooter of the basketball that I've ever seen and probably that has ever lived. But Isaiah Thomas didn't ever try to be that. That wasn't on the list of options because it didn't exist. What year did the three-pointer come in the NBA? 83, 84, something like that? What year did they start shooting threes in the NBA?
I think 79, 80 off the top of my head. I think 80.
In the NBA?
I could be wrong about that.
Okay, then he made it by 1 year. So he won the college basketball championship in 81. Either way, my point is he did not grow up learning to play basketball in order to try and shoot threes. And if you just look at the totality of his game, and being the best player on teams that won two championships in a row, plus a national championship in college, plus, as you pointed out, his greatest performance was in a series they lost to a Laker team that had Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, James Worthy, one of the legendary teams of all time.
Boy, do people forget how people outside of Detroit forget how close they were to winning that series and how close they were to three-peating. And then you're talking about, you're in a different stratosphere.
They were ahead 3-2. They could have won that game 6. Again, he's playing on 1 foot. People forget, how about the game he played against the Knicks in Joe Louis Arena in game 5 of a best of 5? What did he score? 16 points in the last 90 seconds to send that game to overtime where Bernard King and the Knicks ultimately won it. I can still see Hubie in the short sleeve shirt coaching that game. It was like 200 degrees in Joe Louis Arena. But Isaiah, I think he is underappreciated, and this is another one where I think people allow the things that have happened after his career to impact the way we remember him. Like the Isaiah Thomas, who was involved with the failure of the CBA and the failure with the Knicks and all the other things that have happened, have nothing to do with the Isaiah Thomas who was a great basketball player. And as a great player, I believe he is underappreciated.
Well, this is too long of a discussion to get into now at the end of this here, but during his career, there were a couple high-profile incidents of Isaiah shooting himself in the foot. Number one was walking off the court without shaking hands, which I said last week, I actually think too much is made of that. I didn't mind that at the time. I kind of don't mind it now. Little kid me thought it was actually kind of cool because I was a bad loser and a spiteful loser and all that anyway, so I kind of liked it. Yeah. The other one that for some reason has not really come up much, Bomani Jones was talking about it, is when he said Larry Bird would just be another guy if he was black. And I think that if you go back and look, I mean, Isaiah had to do like a whole PR tour to try to get out of that, including a press conference with Larry Bird at the 1987 finals where Larry's wearing a disgusting trucker's hat. And it's like, dude, can you at least take off the hat for the press conference? That also, there just is enough stuff from his playing career where it's like, you didn't have to shoot yourself in the foot that way. But as a player, there's no question that he belonged on the dream team. And look, back-to-back titles, when you're talking about 6 titles in 8 years and the Warriors winning 3 in 5 years, whatever, it doesn't seem like much. The Warriors repeated once with an incredible assemblage of talent. The Spurs did not repeat ever. The Heat repeated once and then dismantled after a while. It's hard to win 2 in a row, and they were a truly great team that won 2 in a row.
And the Warriors only repeated because they brought in the second best player in the league to join a team that was already in the finals. And I will say this too. What Isaiah Thomas said about Larry Bird obviously was a terrible thing to say. It has nothing to do with how good a player he was or wasn't. You know what I mean? Like all these things, I think the bottom line of it is most people don't like Isaiah Thomas. I say that with no rooting interest in it one way or the other. I barely know Isaiah Thomas. It doesn't make any difference to me if people like him or not. But it just bothers me that I hear him left out of conversations. Like let's even say, okay, Steph Curry has passed him. Fair. Curry has changed the sport forever. Let's give him that. I used to have this conversation on the air on Mike and Mike before Steph Curry was Steph Curry. Before Steph Curry was at Davidson when I was having these conversations. And people would be telling me Iverson was better than Isaiah Thomas. And I kept saying to those people, did you watch Isaiah Thomas? I know I've now completely hijacked your entire podcast here.
Right, let go.
I've taken you away from where you wanted to go. But sometimes I think the people who talk about how Isaiah Thomas played didn't see Isaiah Thomas play. But if you watched Isaiah Thomas play, he was unquestionably the best player. The bad boy Pistons, who were an all-time great team, who repeated a time when repeating was all anyone ever did not have another Hall of Famer in the big room. So Joe Dumars is in the Hall of Fame, and he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. He was a terrific player. But Joe Dumars was at no point one of the 6 or 7 best players in the league, right?
No.
The great teams in that era all had that. I mean, the Bird Celtics did, and the Lakers with Magic Kareem did, and Michael had Scotty, and Isaiah Thomas, the next best player on that team, was Joe Dumars. And he was a terrific player. I'm not taking anything away from him, and I believe he is in the Hall of Fame, isn't he? I feel like
yes,
you're looking at it, but he's in the Hall of Fame.
Joe Dumars in the Hall of Fame.
But he's not someone. He's not a player on that. I'm not in any way diminishing him. He was probably he guarded Jordan tougher than anybody guarded Jordan. He was a fabulous player. He was the MVP of the finals one year. He was great. But he wasn't Scottie Pippen, and he damn sure wasn't, Kareem or Magic, whoever you want to put second there. He wasn't Kevin McHale. So Isaiah did it without one of those guys on his team at a time when the Eastern Conference he had to play against Julius Erving and Moses Malone when he first gets there, and then he's got to deal with Bird, and then he's got to deal with Jordan. I think he gets the short end of the historical comparisons.
But by the way, so you brought up Bird Celtics. They never repeated either. I mean, winning 2 consecutive championships back then was it was a huge deal when the Lakers did it in the 80s. It was a huge deal. And it's just, when you say you didn't watch Isaiah Thomas, it's just sort of a natural thing. Like if you're born at a certain time, you didn't watch certain players. And so I know an agent in the NBA who, because of The Last Dance, sent all of his players an iconic Jordan game to watch, and all of his current clients. And they had never watched a full Michael Jordan game because it's not something you really do, right? It's not something that you go, I'm going to sit down tonight and I'm going to watch game 2 start to finish of the 1992 finals and let me look at, you watch highlights, you watch the last couple minutes. These are star NBA players. I've never seen Michael Jordan play a full game from start to finish. It's just sort of, that's how life is. You don't watch. I've never seen, maybe I saw an Oscar Robertson game at some point when I'm doing a deep dive, but I don't think I've ever seen Oscar Robertson play an actual full NBA game. Have you seen Wilt Chamberlain play a full NBA game?
No, probably not. I mean, I remember him when I was a very little kid at the very end of his career, but no, certainly nothing even remotely close to his prime. I guess I would end my soliloquy on Isaiah with this. When people talk about the best players in the NBA in the 80s, and you don't have to have watched the NBA in the 80s. You don't have to be old enough to know the 80s were, in my opinion, a glorious era of basketball. I do not in any way accept the idea that basketball is better now than it was then. It's different. It's not worse, but it's not better either. When people talk about the greatest players in the 80s, I feel like they say Magic, Larry, and Julius Erving, and they leave out Isaiah. And I'm here to tell you Isaiah Thomas belongs in that discussion with those guys. And then there's Kareem, and there were, if you want to start arguing over a handful of other people, we can. Kareem, I still think his best years really were in the 70s, but that's neither here nor there. Isaiah Thomas, I thought of him as a kid learning and watching the game, that he was that good. And, he won a championship in college as the best player on his team. He won 2 NBA championships as the unquestioned best player on his team. I think he deserves to be remembered in a pantheon of players that he is always excluded from. And maybe the primary reason is that people didn't like him.
That's well put, and I'll leave it there. I think that's a really good point. All right, Mike, you've given me more than enough of your time. Obviously, everybody knows they can watch you every morning on Get Up, which is, I think, one of the great success stories at our company and on TV in the last 3 or 4 years. I love going on. I love watching in the morning. I really appreciate you coming on, and let's do it again soon sometime.
Well, we love having you, but wait, I didn't get to say the one thing I most wanted to say, and that is, so you said to me when we were texting, the Michael versus LeBron thing.
Oh boy, here we go.
This is a big deal in my house. Okay, so my son, as I think I told you, is 17, and he loves LeBron James, and he loves the NBA. And he's a little bit also, he's a product of this era where I think fans are less attached to teams than they are to individual players, which is a huge difference from my childhood. So as a kid growing up in New York, when I hated all the great players on other teams because they were the enemy. Now, people go to the Garden to see Steph Curry come to town and to see LeBron James come to town. We never looked at it that way. I was going to the game to see the Knicks. It didn't matter who they were playing. Some of the games were better than others because they were playing good teams, but that was never the intention. That said, my son said to me the other night as we're watching the show, what is it Michael Jordan was better than LeBron at? Like, LeBron is bigger, he's stronger, he's probably just as fast, and he's probably a better passer. He's got any number of things about him that if you're just lining them up skill set by skill set, LeBron probably checks more boxes than Michael does. And I really can't argue with that. But here's what I would say, and maybe you just have to have seen it. But if I were to ask you, if there was one game of basketball being played and your life depended upon the outcome, who would be the first player you would choose?
Michael. Still Michael.
It's it. And I think in a private, honest moment, so would LeBron. I think LeBron would take him. And I think anyone who saw him would take him. And ultimately, the objective of playing a basketball game is to win it. And no one just won it like that guy did. And I can't put it better than that. And it isn't about who was a better shooter and who was. It was about when it came time to win a game, Michael Jordan was going to win it. And part of that is because I never saw him not. I never saw him not do it. And that goes back to what we were saying a little while ago about how we never saw that team dethroned. So that would be my answer, is that LeBron James can do things Michael Jordan couldn't do and that no one else I've ever seen could do. And I would put LeBron James as the second best player I've ever seen. But I will take Michael to break the tie because if they were playing one game and my life depended upon the outcome, I would take him for sure, and I would feel very, very comfortable.
I think when it's all said and done, LeBron is going to have passed him statistically, already has in most major categories. Obviously, the game is totally different now versus when Michael played, and has been that way for almost the entirety of LeBron's career. When you ask what was Michael better at, I think there's an argument to be made that there's an argument to be made that at their absolute apexes, Michael was a better defensive player. I'm not sure if that's true because I haven't thought it out yet, and LeBron is obviously bigger and can offer a degree of rim protection that Michael couldn't, although Michael's shot blocking numbers for a guard were out of this world at that time, and you see the highlights in The Last Dance. A lot of them are blocks and swipes and all that, and LeBron's most iconic play is a defensive play. But Michael, as a one-on-one defender and just an all-around pest, that maybe you could argue maybe he was better. He was just better at scoring. I think that if you want to hang your hat on one thing, LeBron's already passed him in points, I think, right? And will, and
he passed him.
Yeah, he passed him. So I guess technically you could argue LeBron's a better scorer, but LeBron is ahead of him in minutes played already. He's played a lot more minutes. And Michael averaged 37, 35. He's just a better scorer, one-on-one scorer. And I think what we've seen with Kawhi in the last couple of seasons is like there just is no substitute still for one-on-one scoring. When it's down to it and it's the two best defensive teams in the NBA playing against each other at the absolute highest level, there is still no substitute for one-on-one scoring. And that's an area where I'm not saying that makes Michael better, because I think there's a pretty good chance that when it's all said and done, LeBron is going to be known as the best all-around player in the history of basketball. But in that one discrete area, he'll never be Michael, and that one area amplifies in importance in the biggest games and in the biggest moments. And I think that's where Michael will always have him, and will always have everybody else that ever comes after him.
I agree. I think that's well said. I think the beauty and the worst part of these arguments is that in order to make one guy's case, you have to find ways to try to diminish the other. I mean, LeBron James it's hilarious that I have now, since Last Dance came on, developed something of a reputation as being someone who was bashing LeBron, when previously I think my reputation was as someone who I would hype up LeBron too much. People would accuse me of loving him too much, of giving him too much credit, of being all over him all the time. So I love LeBron. I think he's unbelievable. There's nothing on earth I'm taking away from him. But I'm saying there was just something about Michael Jordan's presence that made you say, oh, they're going to win. Like, I don't know exactly how this game is going to go. Any number of things are going to happen. But I can tell you now how it's going to end. The team that has that guy is going to wind up winning. And there is no more important quality that a great player can have than that. And so to me, that I would use, if we're going to say that we're splitting hairs, that's the hair I would split.
Michael also has it's interesting how history is written by the winners. So like the 1995 playoffs when they lose to Orlando has just kind of like, it's just not talked about because it doesn't count. He had just come back from baseball, blah, blah, blah. If you throw that out, their first 6 or 7 years in the league, they don't win big. Like they don't win at the absolute highest level. Both of them are parallel. If you throw 95 out, what Michael really doesn't have is a black mark. And LeBron has the 2011 finals against the Mavs where he just didn't play like LeBron. He was out of it. He wasn't mentally, he just didn't rise to the moment. And in fact, he kind of cratered a little bit in the moment. And you could maybe place a couple of other games here or there. People will throw the 2010 playoffs at him, his last playoffs with the Cavs. Michael doesn't have that. And I think that, as much as anything else, colors this discussion because, to your point, there's just an air of infallibility that LeBron will never have, because we saw him on the very biggest stage. Just isolate the Mavericks series, we saw him fail, and he failed in a very high profile and spectacular way, and we just never saw it with Michael ever.
That's right. Now, if you wanted to make one quick argument in favor of LeBron, how many times was LeBron the best player on the floor in series he had no chance to win, right? I mean, in at least two finals I can think of, which was the year, the first year when Kyrie and Love were both hurt, whatever year that was.
2015.
Like, in my opinion, it is a travesty he wasn't voted MVP.
I voted for him. I'm voted for him. I was one of the 4 voters who voted for him.
Congratulations. If they had gotten swept, I would have said you could vote anyone you want. The fact that team won 2 games in that series was an extraordinary accomplishment. And then he also, I thought, was the best player on the floor in a series they had no chance to win the first year Durant was there. They had no chance to beat that team. No one was going to beat that
2017
team.
And then 2018, where Kyrie is gone by that point.
Is that the J.R. Smith game with the?
Yes.
So look, they weren't going to win those series no matter what. Nobody was.
That game may be game 1 when they go with the J.R. Smith game.
Yeah,
they go to overtime and lose. LeBron has 50, I think, or 51 in that game. That might be the best game I've ever seen any player play. Period. Multiple people with the Warriors have told me that's the best game they've ever seen anybody play, because it was LeBron and really a supporting cast that wasn't up to that. I mean, that's an all-time Warriors team. That's the team you're talking about with Durant, Clay, all of them.
Right.
LeBron by himself was like, I don't care that you have Steph and KD, 2 MVPs, and all these other dudes. I am single-handedly going to win this game, and I'm going to bowl over Draymond Green like he's freaking Zach Lowe and lay the ball in time and time. He couldn't have kept that up over a full series, but for that one game, and they lost, so whatever. I don't know that I've ever seen anybody play like that. Play better than that.
They got bad calls in that game. Remember, there was a bad call late in that game, or at least a very questionable call on a block charge that was being a very big deal late in that game. And then obviously J.R. Smith makes one of the colossal mistakes that have ever been made in a big spot that's well documented. So I put those things on LeBron's side. So to be clear, I don't hold LeBron's record in the finals against him. There's only one that I hold against him, and that's the one you pointed out was the series against Dallas. They were the better team. He didn't play well, and they lost. So that's the only one you hold against him. But that is not, to me, the difference. I'm not – again, if someone wants to tell me, I enjoy this because I enjoy the give and take. You get no argument from me on LeBron. But Michael just – I don't know. He was a combination of – I think I said this on Stugatz's podcast as well. He was the most perfect combination of charisma and ferocity that I've ever seen. So it's very hard to be the most charismatic person and be the most ferocious competitor. Like, that's a very difficult line to walk because usually ferocity isn't very pretty to watch. But Jordan had a beauty. It was a thing of beauty to watch him play basketball, and yet he was the most ferocious competitor out there. He would kill you to beat you, but he did it in a way that he had like the gracefulness of like a ballet dancer. It's an impossible combination, and he was it. So to see him was like seeing something that I've never seen before, and I'm glad, as a final thought here, that so many younger people who are listening to this conversation right now, who, to your point, never got a chance to see Michael Jordan play, are getting to see what it is all of us were so excited about back then.
But there's no games on, so I would say to those people, go back and watch a game. Some of them are a little too grainy on YouTube. Go back and watch an early three-peat like we were talking about before. Go back and watch a Portland Finals game, and you'll just look at this guy and be like, well, this guy is just, wow. Go back and watch the 63-point game against Boston. Go back and watch one of those games. Anyway, Mike, thank you for your time. Everyone knows where to watch you. I hope I get to see you in person at some point before 2021. But it's been a pleasure. Thanks, man.
Hell yes. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good to see you.